In 1932, while millions of Americans were starving in the Great Depression, one man was controlling more power than the president. Samuel Insull didn't just build the power grid, he owned the very light in your home. But behind the brilliance of the king of utilities was a $12 billion house of cards that was about to plunge the nation into literal and financial darkness. This is the audit of the greatest fraud you've never heard of. The story begins in 1881. A young, ambitious 21-year-old British stenographer named Samuel Insull answered a blind advertisement in a newspaper. The position was highly sought after, private secretary to the most famous inventor on Earth. He got the job. His boss was not just any employer, it was the Wizard of Menlo Park himself, Thomas Edison. This was the moment the humble immigrant stepped into the orbit of genius, setting the stage for a spectacular rise. For a grueling, formative decade, Insull remained glued to Edison's side. He didn't just manage business affairs, he managed the man's entire life, buying his clothes and writing his checks. More importantly, this placed Insull in the absolute epicenter of the Industrial Revolution, changing the fabric of society, the radical, nationwide electrification of America. Insull's ambition demanded a bigger stage. When J.P. Morgan orchestrated the merger that created General Electric, Insull was passed over for the top job. He didn't retreat, he relocated to Chicago. Taking over the struggling local utility, he transformed it within a decade into the world's largest electricity producer. His secret weapon wasn't just the technology itself, but a revolutionary financial innovation that made the system possible and, ultimately, doomed it. The real genius of Samuel Insull wasn't just technical, it was economic, rooted in a concept he called load factor. He recognized that a power plant cost the exact same to operate whether it sat idle or ran at maximum capacity. The fuel wasn't the expense, the idle capacity was. So he flipped the model. He slashed rates, introduced two-tiered pricing, and dropped homeowner bills by nearly a third. By flooding Main Street with cheap electric appliances, he didn't just sell power, he engineered a relentless 24-hour demand for it. By 1907, Insull had consolidated absolute control over all of Chicago's electricity. By 1920, his expanding empire boasted 500,000 customers alongside annual revenues hitting $40 million. He successfully engineered a regulated monopoly that was legally protected and completely insulated from market competition. Yet, this total dominance of the grid was only the warm-up phase. Insull realized he had discovered a mechanism far more lucrative than electricity itself: the financial pyramid. Samuel Insull didn't just build physical power plants of steel and steam. He engineered an unprecedented financial machine the likes of which America had never witnessed before. By stacking holding company upon holding company, he created a dizzying maze of corporate ownership that divorced actual operations from pure speculation. In 1912, Insull executed his masterstroke, the creation of Middle West Utilities. This was the first of many holding companies. The concept was simple but lethal. A holding company exists only to own shares in other companies. Insull built an intricate, dizzying structure, companies that owned other companies. It was a perfect financial pyramid. And at the very apex, controlling this immense, opaque fortune, sat Samuel Insull. The absolute beauty of the pyramid structure was pure, unfiltered leverage. Insull managed to control $500 million in physical assets using a razor-thin equity base of just $27 million. By issuing stock in one tier to buy control of another, he kept the cycle spinning while masking the creeping debt underneath. To maintain the illusion, he relied on stock dividends. paying out shares instead of real cash. This conjured phantom income out of thin air artificially inflated stock prices and made the entire towering structure look unimaginably wealthy. At its dizzying peak, Insull's combined empire reached a staggering valuation equivalent to over $12 billion today. He commanded 85 separate corporations and personally chaired 65 corporate boards, standing shoulder to shoulder with titans like Henry Ford and Thomas Edison. He presented himself as a profound philanthropist, funding hospitals, African American charities, and the arts, while ultimately constructing the magnificent Chicago Civic Opera House as a monument to his civic standing. He appeared to be an unshakable pillar of society. But the entire foundation was built entirely on shifting sand. The entire financial pyramid rested on a convenient legal loophole. The Supreme Court's 1920 ruling in Eisner versus Macomber established that stock dividends did not count as taxable income. Insull aggressively exploited this precedent, and copycats across the country rushed to join the game. The abuse became an epidemic across Wall Street and the Midwest. A system sustained entirely by paper promises and legal fictions could only defy gravity for so long before it all came crashing down.
If you're realizing that corporate history is darker than the textbooks let on, hit that subscribe button. We audit a new hidden history every week.
October 1929. The stock market shattered, plunging the nation into the abyss of the Great Depression. Yet Insull flatly refused to accept reality, stubbornly predicting the downturn would last no more than 3 months. Convinced of his own infallibility, he began dumping his personal fortune into aggressive stock purchases, trying, through sheer will and capital, to single-handedly prop up the collapsing American financial market. The Depression ground on relentlessly. Millions lost their livelihoods, and as factories went dark and homes went cold, electricity consumption plummeted. Passenger traffic on Insull's sprawling network of interurban electric railways evaporated overnight. The cash flow feeding the lower tiers dried up, and without new money coming in, the magnificent financial pyramid began its terrifying, irreversible descent into collapse. In April 1932, a desperate meeting unfolded at the exclusive Chicago Club. Insull and his bankers dared not gather anywhere else, terrified that a single whisper of panic would leak to the public. Behind closed doors, the inevitable receivership was finally agreed upon. The colossal empire was officially collapsing. By June 1932, the reckoning had arrived. Samuel Insull had resigned from 56 corporations. He had lost everything: his accumulated fortune, his hard-won reputation, and his towering corporate empire. Facing imminent ruin and potential imprisonment, he abruptly fled the country, with rumors swirling that he escaped disguised as a woman, to desperately evade prosecution. The collapse completely obliterated 600,000 middle-class investors, wiping out the lifetime savings of ordinary Americans who had placed their blind trust in Insull's vision. The very man who had brought cheap electricity into their homes had ultimately reduced their futures to worthless paper. While the FBI relentlessly tracked him across Europe, Insull bounced from France to Greece, exploiting a lack of extradition treaties. Yet his luck finally ran out when he was arrested off a boat in Turkey and dragged back to Chicago to face the judgment of a broken nation. In October 1934, a fallen Samuel Insull finally stepped into a federal courtroom to stand trial for mail fraud, embezzlement, and violations of federal bankruptcy laws. The media dubbed it the trial of the century. The wizard of the power grid, once commanding towers of steel and millions of investors, now sat before a jury of ordinary citizens, forced to answer for a collapsed empire built on paper and hubris. The prosecution laid out a blistering portrait of a con man driven by greed. They confronted the jury with a brutal, stark contrast. While a staggering 25% of the American workforce walked the streets unemployed in 1931, Samuel Insull was still pulling in a personal salary of nearly $500,000 from his collapsing web of corporations. The defense mounted a passionate counterattack, arguing that Insull was no criminal, but rather a visionary whose only sin was failing to stop an economic earthquake. They reminded the court that he had poured his own multi-million-dollar fortune back into the company in a desperate bid to save it. To hear them tell it, Insull wasn't the architect of the disaster. He was just another tragic victim swallowed whole by the Great Depression. The jury deliberated for a mere 2 hours before officially acquitting Insull and all 16 of his co-defendants of every charge. Insull walked out of the courtroom a completely free man. However, the broader political and economic damage was already permanent. President Franklin D. Roosevelt branded Insull a public enemy and weaponized the scandal to ram through historic federal oversight. This included the Securities Act of 1933 and the Public Utilities Holding Company Act of 1935, which delivered an effective death sentence to utility pyramids across the country. One man's staggering hubris and financial alchemy ultimately forged the modern regulatory framework that keeps our electrical grid safe and operational today. The catastrophic fallout of the Insull scandal directly catalyzed the creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission to police the markets. It systematically dismantled sprawling utility monopolies and cracked open, opaque corporate structures. Most importantly, it established critical firewalls to shield ordinary investors from the kind of phantom wealth and leverage that vanished with 600,000 savings accounts.
Was Insull a visionary who got caught in a crash, or a calculated fraudster? Let me know your verdict in the comments. I'm reading every single one.
On July 16, 1938, Samuel Insull drew his final breath inside a Paris subway station. He was 78 years old. When his pockets were emptied, they found just 30 cents left to his name. He died entirely alone. The man who had once commanded a $12 billion empire and electrified an entire nation was left with nothing. Yet his legacy remains a profound contradiction. He delivered cheap electricity, brought brilliant illumination to the masses, and proved himself an undeniable genius of the grid. His wreckage forced a nation to build a shield. The man who mastered the grid and broke the market ultimately left behind the hard-won laws that protect our savings and our lights today. History explained: the rise, the fall, and the reckoning of Samuel Insull.
Samuel Insull died with 30 cents in his pocket, but his $12 billion ghost still haunts every power line in America. But while Insull was building a pyramid of paper, another man was building a trillion-dollar empire out of something far more sinister. Next week, we're heading back to the Congo, not for a political hit, but for the biggest corporate heist in human history. We're auditing the man who owned an entire country as his private bank account, King Leopold II. You won't want to miss the Rubber Terror audit. I'll see you there.